Palestinian elections for the first time in almost 15 years. Why now, and what are the implications for Palestinians and Israelis? Hello, I'm Anand Naidu, and this is The Heat. Last month, the two largest Palestinian factions, Fatah and Hamas, agreed on a deal to hold elections for the first time in almost 15 years. After years of unrest with Israel and the ongoing Israeli occupation of the West Bank, could these elections offer a new beginning? The news also comes after Israel recently normalized relations with two Arab countries, the United Arab Emirates and Bahrain. The Secretary General of the Palestine Liberation Organization has outlined details of the election agreement.
The agreement reached specified sequential elections. First, we begin with the legislative elections, presidential, and then Palestine National Council election. We agreed on an election system of 100% proportional system. We agreed that these elections will take place in 6 months in accordance with our election law.
Joining me now from Gaza is CGTN correspondent Noor Harazin. Noor, how are Palestinians reacting to this development? The first time major Palestinian elections are going to be held in almost 15 years. And are they expected to go ahead?
Well, Palestinians are happy and surprised at the same time to see the two rival parties, Fatah and Hamas, agreeing finally on elections. This has happened before, basically, where Fatah and Hamas agree on holding elections. This has happened before several years ago in Egypt, in Saudi Arabia, and Qatar. However, it never went smoothly and no elections were held on the ground. However, Palestinians this time are hopeful just because what was happening recently here on the ground in Palestine, the latest Israeli plans of annexations of parts of the West Bank and Jordan Valley, and also the Israeli normalization with Arab countries such as the UAE and Bahrain. All of these things might got the two rival parties, Fatah and Hamas, together against the latest Israeli plans. So this time, Palestinians are really hopeful that the elections will go on and elections will be held in Palestine in the next months.
Noor, you've covered this story very closely. What can we expect? What are some of the potential outcomes from these elections?
Well, we know that there will be two elections, legislative council elections and also presidential elections. The council elections will happen first. The elections committee said that they will need at least 100 days just to finish the first part of the elections. After that, the elections will begin. We all know, Palestinians all know, that the two rival parties, Fatah and Hamas, will win the biggest numbers of seats in the council. However, no one knows what will happen after that, as the two rival parties had the biggest fight 15 years ago just because of the council elections when Hamas won over Fatah. However, Palestinians are hopeful that this time, whoever wins the council elections, everything will go smoothly, and the two rival parties, Fatah and Hamas, will agree on taking government in Gaza and the West Bank.
Thanks, Noor. That's CGTN's Noor Harazin reporting from Gaza. There's much to discuss, so let's get to our panel. Joining me now via Skype is Khalil Jahshan. He is the Executive Director of the Arab Center right here in Washington, D.C. Joining us too via Skype from London is Abdel Bari Atwan. He is the Editor-in-Chief of al-Youm, a digital news and opinion website. With us from Jerusalem is Mitchell Barak. He is a pollster, commentator, and Israeli political analyst. And with us too in Washington, D.C. is Edmund Ghareeb. He is an academic and Middle East expert. Welcome to all of you. Khalil Jahshan, let me start with you. After 15 years, it looks like the Palestinians will have their first major elections. Why do you think both the major factions, Fatah and Hamas, have agreed to elections?
Frankly, those elections are long overdue. They should have taken place, as you implied, many years ago. The situation internally, in terms of the continued military occupation, the restrictions associated with that, and the divisions within Palestinian society, particularly irreconcilable differences between the leadership in Ramallah and their counterparts in Gaza, prevented that from happening. Now there is a convergence of interest, if you will. Both sides are interested in ending the current isolation, if you will, within the Palestinian leadership. So it's within their interest to kind of embark on this attempt of new elections for Palestinian society.
Khalil, you say irreconcilable. Do you think the two sides have agreed to put their differences aside just for these elections? I mean, could these differences re-emerge at at a point later?
Of course. I mean, politics is all about differences and difference of opinion, particularly if they were to be conducted in a democratic fashion where people are entitled to come up with their own political platform. You cannot dictate. If you were a Republican candidate, you cannot dictate to Democrats and vice versa. You know, we have seen, Anan, we have seen this film before. So even though the two parties say they have put their differences aside and have consulted this time with all kinds of factions in Palestinian society, it remains to be seen whether this reconciliation is indeed genuine or not.
Abdel Bari Atwan, there were the elections in 2006. Hamas and Fatah formed a unity government, but that soon collapsed after there was violence in Gaza. There was clashes there. Hamas has been running Gaza, as we know, and Fatah, the Palestinian Authority. Now there is talk of unity, partnership and reconciliation. Do you believe that these upcoming elections can unite the Palestinians?
Well, I have my own doubts, to be honest, not because of the Palestinians, they don't want this election, but also because the Israeli and the American, European, they could actually block this election. They could actually make it completely non and void. Why? Because we remember you mentioned, Anan, in 2006. In 2006, there was a very fair Palestinian election. Everybody in the world recognized its fairness, and Hamas won this election. And what happened? The Israelis said, we are not going to deal with this government. The Americans supported the Israeli point of view and put democracy aside. So suppose this election took place, which I said I doubt, I think the Israeli will be the first one to prevent it from taking place. And even if they allowed it to take place, I believe they will not recognize it and they are not going to deal with it. So this is the problem. Now the Palestinians find out that they have to unite themselves. They have actually to legitimize their authority by this election, to extend Mr. Abbas, the President Abbas, legitimacy by giving him this kind of democracy. So, but what the Palestinians are planning, I don't believe it will be accepted by the American administration in particular, who took a different side, who actually supported the Israeli, who killed the two-state solution, who actually cut everything, stopped recognizing the PLO, and we know closed the PLO office in Washington.
All right, let me bring Mitchell Barak into the discussion. Mitchell, how are these elections viewed in Israel? Do you think they will change anything in the Israeli-Palestinian relationship?
Well, I don't know. There's a lot of opportunity today in the Middle East. I mean, you know, I don't know. It's interesting to hear the previous guest to talk that it's almost Israel's fault that there haven't been an election in 15 years because the U.S. and or Israel did not want to work with the Hamas government. I mean, the Hamas in most countries is defined as a terror organization. I mean, I guess if the Ku Klux Klan was running for Senate somewhere in the United States, most countries in the United States wouldn't recognize that election. You know, it's a terror organization. So I think that they, you know, have to, I think it's a great opportunity for the Palestinians to get together. I think the Palestinian people deserve to have a leadership that they elect, not once every 14 or 15 years. From Israel's point of view, there has definitely been a stalemate in the peace process and the relations with the Palestinians. Some of it is at the fault of Israel. Some of it is at the fault of, Abu Mazen, who's really in charge of the West Bank, who continues to pay terrorists and support terror and so forth. But there's a real opportunity here. Israelis are very, very optimistic lately and even euphoric, because we've seen lately in the last few weeks on the White House, not far from your studio, is that Israel signed agreements, whether you want to call them peace agreements, normalization agreements, with Bahrain and the United Arab Emirates. And we're actually having direct flights. We're having business between them. We had the Saudis maybe next. The Saudis came out and they lashed out against the Palestinian leadership. And for 70 years, they said that you've been, misrepresenting and hurting the Palestinian people. So there's real euphoria. There's a chance for real change from the Israeli point of view. And I think the Israelis will be willing to take more risks now that we have a regional backing in different places. But the Palestinians have to come forward and elect some real leadership that's ready to make some kind of agreement, ready to come to the table, ready to make concessions, and ready to recognize Israel as a Jewish state with the right to exist. And I think that they will find a willing partner on this side. So it's a very exciting time for Israelis, regionally, and with our neighbors, the Palestinians.
Right. Abdel Bari Atwan, what do you make of Mitchell Barak's argument that Hamas may have won the election in 2006, but they were not considered the legitimate government of the Palestinians at that time by the Israelis nor by the United States because of tactics that they adopted against Israel?
I am really surprised to hear that, especially the comparison between Ku Klux Klan and Hamas, which is unbelievable. It is really, really not acceptable at all, because Hamas is controlling Gaza Strip. It was elected. It was actually still negotiating with Israel directly or indirectly, actually, and they made a lot of deal with the Israelis. So I don't believe the Israeli, with their double standard, can make the situation easier in the West Bank and Gaza. If he said that, the Arab now normalizing relation with the Israeli, but what the Israeli are giving to the Palestinian because of that, what's the reward for them? We know that there is a plan for the annexation of most of the West Bank and also the Jordan Valley to the Israeli state. We know that they want the Israel or Palestine, occupied Palestine, to be actually a Jewish state, which is a high standard of racism. What about the Christian Palestinian? What about the Muslim Palestinian? What about the Druze Palestinian? Only for Jews. And this is not democracy, not the human rights.
Okay.
So,
Edmund Ghareeb, do you think these elections will go ahead, and how significant will they be, not just for Palestinians, but for the region? We know that there's a lot of moving pieces in the Middle East right now. As we just heard, Israel has normalized diplomatic relations with 2 Arab states in the past few weeks. We had that signing ceremony here in Washington.
Clearly, there are significant changes have taken place on the ground. The most important, of course, is that we have seen the third wave of Arab attempts to normalize with Israel, and here in Washington, this attempt to normalize relations between the UAE and Bahrain with Israel is considered as a step or an important step toward achieving peace between the Israelis and the Palestinians. I think it's important to remember, first of all, that the first and the second wave, the peace process was between Sadat's Egypt and between Jordan and Israel. Both of these countries are belt countries. They are neighbors. They are surround Israel and the West Bank and Gaza. They are next to them, so they are part of they have been in a state of war, while the 2 countries that recently signed the agreements are from outside that belt region. The only other country would be Syria that would be similar. And so their interests are not really, and what we are seeing, it's not really the peace process as such, although it has been, the media here and the government have been misleading in saying that this advances the peace process. It is normalization. It's in the sense that there are interests on both sides. I think the United States wants to make sure that they are able to support Israel. President Trump wants to support the Prime Minister of Israel also, and the Israelis believe this is an ideal moment for them to make significant gains, basically because that they couldn't achieve maybe under the Obama administration. We're hearing that the annexation, which is illegal under international law, is even being described basically as applying sovereignty, which is a Orwellian language that shows part of the problem. But the second thing that I think is also very significant here is what we have seen with the Arab political system, the Arab political order. First of all, the Palestinians, as we heard from all of the guests, there have been problems, serious problems between the Palestinians themselves. This has undermined the Palestinian position. It has weakened the Palestinian argument. And that's why, in fact, we are seeing now, I think the Palestinians are cornered. They realize that there are changes taking place in the region, that there are more Arab governments willing to enter into talks with Israel, and that is certainly very worrisome to them. And part of the problem, part of the reason, part of the responsibility is theirs. So that's another factor that's pushing them to try to get together and to see if it works.
Khalil Jahshan, the Palestinians are divided, and as we just heard from Edmund Ghareeb, they are undermining their own position vis-à-vis Israel. We heard Mahmoud Abbas say that peace, security and stability will not be achieved in the region until the Israeli occupation ends. But the Israelis, we've heard from them as well, and they say, we need a partner to negotiate with. Do you think these elections could in some way lead to unity among the Palestinians and give Israel its partner that it can negotiate with?
If what you state in your preface is accurate and is reflected on the ground, then the answer is yes. But frankly, these are myths. These are red herrings. These are excuses that we have heard all along. I mean, I was present in Algiers in 1988 when the PLO recognized Israel, and the U.S. administration accepted that. And as a result, a process emerged over the subsequent years. And I attended events with Rabin and Paris and Arafat and others. There was a partner. Now the question is, what happened to that partner? I mean, Mitchell would tell us, as he said earlier, that the Israelis are willing to reciprocate if the Palestinian side would recognize Israel. They have recognized Israel years ago. They live and accept Israeli occupation, for God's sake. What else do you want them to recognize? So there are a lot of propagandistic excuses standing in the way of that. The fact of the matter, these elections will be meaningless as a free and democratic election because the Palestinians remain under Israeli occupation. You cannot have, if Israel were under occupation, look, I mean, Israel is having difficulty having a standing election under normal condition as a sovereign state. They had to do it 3 times. I might have to do it a 4th time in the next few months. And how do you expect the Palestinians to do that under military occupation?
Mitchell, Barak, let me give you a chance to respond to that. We just heard there that the Palestinians do recognize Israel as a state and that they're just using this as propaganda to maintain the status quo.
Well, yes and no. I mean, technically, maybe they have recognized that we signed the Oslo Accords with them in the early 90s, 93, I believe. That's significant. That really created the Palestinian Authority and put the Israelis and Palestinians on the path for creating some type of, some type of solution, lasting solution. I think there's 2 things. First of all, also, Israelis want to be recognized as the Jewish state of Israel, home for the Jewish people. But also I think there's a problem because Abu Mazen and certainly Hamas, they maybe have recognized Israel at some point, but the paying of terrorists, rewarding terror, supporting terror on the one hand, while still fighting it with the Palestinian police on the other, is not the message Israelis want to see. But let me back up for a second. I think what's really important here to realize we have a lot in common with the Palestinians because we also have a leadership crisis, like was just mentioned. We had 3 elections. We may have a 4th, meaning a lot of Israelis will say, even the supporters of Netanyahu, He's really been in power just too long. He can't even manage the coronavirus. We're leading the world in coronavirus infections and coronavirus deaths. We're going to need a change in leadership. I don't know whether that's going to happen in the next few months, in the next year, but we're really going to need a change of leadership. And when we have that change of leadership, I think then we will see a real opportunity. At the same time, Abu Mazen is now entering, you know, the 14th or 15th year of his 4-term presidency.
Right.
And I think, you know, he's quite an older gentleman. He's led the Palestinians, and it's really, they need to have some fresh leadership willing to take risks. The last thing I'll say is what Bari Atwan said. I think it's time to get off of the victimization, you know, victims, occupation. It's language that really doesn't work. Because for all these years, you've gotten the entire Arab world to say we need to boycott Israel because of the occupation. That doesn't work. Stop thinking of yourself as victims and start thinking of yourself as now is the opportunity to do something for the next generation. Because I think the peace train has left the station here in the Middle East. And it's going to stop just one more time in Ramallah. And either the Palestinians are going to decide to get on that train, or they're not. And they're going to miss it again.
All right,
but this is going to be the last time. And it's a real opportunity to really seize it.
Okay, Abdel Bari Atwan, what's your response to that?
Well, I'm surprised to hear that. The Palestinians have been talking with the Israeli for the last 27 years. And what's the outcome? 800,000 settlers in the West Bank. And more, actually, sanctions, more brutality, more occupation, more settlements. So, and to say that, you know, the Palestinians should recognize the Jewish state, Israel as a Jewish state. You know, the Palestinians never interfered in the Israeli internal policy. But what about 1.5 million Arabs, Muslim and Christian living in Israel 1948? So what happened to those people? Are they going to consider them as a 10th class citizen, for example? But the Jews only the first class and the others are non-existent completely? This is really the highest type of racism.
Yeah, Abdel Bari Atwan, one other thing, you know, Michel Barak pointed out a moment ago that the peace train, as he said, has left the station. And to some extent that is true, isn't it? Because we look at events happening beyond Israel, beyond the Palestinian territories. We have Arab countries now normalizing relations with Israel. That is President Trump's version, actually, of pushing this peace plan. He hopes to expand Israel's relationship with the Arab world. He says Palestinians also want to be a part of that. He talked about it recently at the White House, where he was joined by leaders from Israel, from the United Arab Emirates, as well as Bahrain. This is what he said. Let's listen to him.
And we've been given very strong signals that they'd like to be a part of what's happening. So I think we'll see the Palestinians at some point, but before we see the Palestinians, we'll see other very important countries come into this transaction. They'd be here today, frankly, if we wanted them.
So looking at what has been happening, Abdel Bari Atwan, isn't the pressure now on the Palestinians?
No, it's not the Palestinian, actually. The pressure is on the Israelis because they are now using the United States to put pressure on other Arab countries to normalize the relation. The problem with Israel is not with Bahrain or United Arab Emirates or Saudi Arabia. The problem with the Israelis is with the Palestinians themselves. So if they don't look at the Palestinian question and actually give the Palestinians their rights, the two-state solution, I think, you know, this will ignite more frustration and more maybe trouble inside the West Bank and Gaza Strip. I don't think the Palestinians will throw the towel and listen to Trump and accept the deal of the century, as they call it.
All right, Edmund Ghareeb, what is your view on this? I mean, can you give us a sense of how much this rapprochement between Israel and the Arab countries is impacting events in the Middle East, is changing the map of the Middle East in some way?
Well, there's no doubt that these steps are very important. They divert in many ways from even the Arab peace plan that was adopted in Beirut quite a while ago, and it was a Saudi initiative. So this is significant in the sense that shows that there are changes taking place within the Arab political order. There are a number of Arab countries who are putting their own interests as they see those interests first. They, for example, what we see from the UAE and from Bahrain, they are very much worried about Iran. They would like to buy also advanced weapons from the United States. They have economic issues such as the tariffs that they are paying, especially the UAE here on their exports. This is an issue they want to resolve with the United States. So there are a number of other issues that are driving them to move in that direction. Nevertheless, the Arab-Israeli conflict, the Palestinian-Israeli conflict actually remains an important issue for a lot of Arabs. It's true that many of the countries, for example, if you take a look at the region, we find that a number of countries, central countries historically, such as Syria, such as Iraq, such as Libya to a certain extent, these are Lebanon are facing a lot of difficulties, a lot of internal problems, and many people are focusing on their own issues, on their own concerns. So that is a factor. Nevertheless, polls have shown that there is still a great deal of sympathy for, in the Arab world, among the Arab populations, regardless of where they are, for the Palestinian people, for the Palestinian cause. And there is also, as we almost everyone agreed, that there is a responsibility on the shoulders of the Palestinians themselves. Nevertheless, I think right now this is a very important step that what the Palestinians are taking, and they have the capabilities. The Palestinians are still able, they could take actions that may surprise a lot of people down the road.
Khalil Jahshan, if we look at the situation on the ground, Israel settlements have expanded significantly in the West Bank. The Israeli treatment of Palestinians, that's been condemned internationally as well. Can the elections change that? You know, that's a reality that's on the ground right now. Can the elections change it, or is it too late?
I think it's too late for that purpose. The elections, if they are allowed and can take place, and of course there are a lot of issues. I mean, which Palestinians are going to be allowed to vote? Are Jerusalemites going to participate? Is Gaza going to join the West Bank in these elections? Will Israel allow, as a military occupier, allow these elections to take place? So there are a lot of issues that need to be settled in advance of these elections. But should the elections take place, they can't be conducted according to the rules of the old game. We had elections before and they fizzled. They did not produce the intended results. If we are to have democratic and secular, free elections in Palestine today, a lot of changes have to be adopted by all parties concerned if they are going to lead to change of leadership on the Palestinian side and change of platform, change of politics. You cannot continue to have, if you will, the factional politics that characterize Palestinian politics over the half century in the past. And there has to be some serious changes, and nobody is thinking about those changes. So I'm not impressed by the call for elections just for the sake of elections.
Okay, Mitchell, Barak, I've only got a minute left. What is the best scenario for Israel from these elections? Or does Israel, in fact, even care? As you pointed out, Israel has its own political troubles right now.
Yeah, I mean, I think in the ranking of Israeli problems, it's pretty low right now. But, you know, I live in Jerusalem. It's always on the table. And Israelis are feeling like now is a real opportunity, partially because of, obviously, President Trump. We don't know if that's going to continue. But it also maybe puts more pressure on the Palestinians, but also more pressure on the Israelis, because we've gotten a lot of things from the United States. And as we know, there's no such thing as a free lunch. And at some point, we're going to have to pay for that, or we're going to have to make serious concessions, especially if President Joe Biden comes in. Again, Israelis like the feeling of no conflict, peace, and it's something that they yearn for. So if there can be a way to find something with the Palestinians, yes, I agree, the settlements are an issue. And Israelis have, every administration has been going full force with them. Certainly an issue, certainly should be discussed. And I understand the Palestinian side on that issue. And I understand also what Mr. Bari Atwan said about some of the refugees, some of the people that left in 1948. We also have 1.5 million to 2 million Israeli Arabs here in Israel. So we know how to live with Israeli Arabs, Israeli Muslims, Israeli Christians, in Nazareth, in Baqa el Gharbiya, in Haifa, and other places. So the idea here is to find a place that we can all live together. There's real promise right now because the sands are shifting in the Middle East. For many years it didn't, and now it is. So now's a real opportunity. Elections are important.
Okay, and we have to leave it there. Thanks to all of you for being with us. And that is it for this edition of The Heat. Thanks for joining us.